you.
Thank you very much. What that really tells you is that I spent a lot of my life not knowing quite what I'm doing and being a bit manic in the process as well. But it was truly going on the foundation course and being taught by people like Jeremy. It was also a particular point in my own development with therapy and so on as well, that I felt something settling, actually, almost sort of for the first time. And so it's really a joy for me to come this evening and offer some of these thoughts about Owen Barfield and Christianity, sort of almost, I feel, offering it back, because temenos has been very, very important to me. And I do say to people when they ask me now, but I want to know about this for myself, I say, well, have you heard of the Temenos Academy? Because it made all the difference to me. So thank you very much. Jeremy also alluded there that Christianity needs to recover something of its mystical core, and that indeed is what I'm going to try and talk about, because that's what Owen Barfield has helped me see more clearly than I ever did before, really, even though I was a priest for a while. I think it really matters. I guess I'm preaching to the converted here, but we are in desperate times for one reason or another. And I think this matters not just to Christians and to the church, but maybe even for our civilization, to try and recover a sense of connection with the spiritual dimension of things. And Barfield always said that alienation is a necessary precursor to renewal and discovery. That was very much part of his understanding of evolution of consciousness. So maybe that's so. And I'm trying to sort of do what I can to help get his ideas out there to facilitate that possibility and see what happens, along with others, including his grandson, Owen Barfield, too, who it's been really good to connect with and feel in the flow of that as well. Some of you may have seen or heard Malcolm Geit's talk on Owen Barfield, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago in this room. I was listening again to it, and I hope that mine will kind of complement what Malcolm was saying. Malcolm was very much focusing on Barfield's notions around meaning and the need to have a shared or participative sense of what we know, so as well you know it from the inside as well as from the outside in order to rediscover meaning. And he drew a lot on Barfield's book Poetic Diction to do that. I'm going to draw more on Barfield's book Saving the Appearances, which is where he talks mostly about Christianity. And the history of the evolution of consciousness really comes to the fore there. So I hope that this talk will complement Malcolm's, who has helped me in the writing of the book very much too. So I wanted to acknowledge him that way. But I thought we could start perhaps with a recap on Barfield, just to kind of get us into the mood. And then once I've explained his key ideas, maybe you've heard these before, then I wanted to go through kind of 3,000 years of Christianity with images from about 1,000 years before through the birth of Jesus, through Christendom and up to the present day. Because, as again I'm sure everybody in the room will appreciate, unless you have a feel for these ideas, they make no difference at all. But here broadly is the idea. There's Owen Barfield. He lived through quite an evolution of consciousness himself. Queen Victoria was still on the throne when he was born, and he died 6 months after Tony Blair became Prime Minister. So maybe it's not surprising he latched onto this idea. And he's there with his fellow Inklings, in particular with C.S. Lewis there, then there's Barfield, then, it's Tolkien, isn't it? Then Barfield, then Charles Williams, and then Lewis in that group there. But his idea that he discovered through the study of words was that words have a soul, they carry meaning, they carry life, which is why they make sense to us and aren't just acoustic noises in the air. And then he realized that means that words are also fossils of consciousness, that you can use words in much the same way that biologists might use fossils and dig them out of the ground to tell a story of human evolution. So too, if you track back words, you can find out how human consciousness has evolved. And he did that over about this 3,000-year span, partly, I think, because that was the time we have extant, particularly spiritual literature, It does go back into earlier times too, but you can really get to grips with it from, say, the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible and from the oldest parts of the Greek canon as well, Homer, which is what I'm going to focus on tonight, partly for the sake of simplicity. And he developed his big idea. He said that he was like a hedgehog. He had one idea rather than like the fox that has many, and he devoted his life to unpacking it. So that's broadly his idea. To give you another sort of bit, slightly more felt sense of it, I love this picture by Van Gogh of the wind in the cypress trees, because I think it illustrates one of the things that Barfield discovered about one particular word, which is the word pneuma in Greek, or ruach in Hebrew. The word that we now have to translate either as wind, or breath, or spirit. And we have to kind of decide which one it might mean. But in, for example, John's Gospel, where the writer of John's Gospel wrote, the pneuma blows where it wills, no one knows where it comes from or where it's going. That is the way with the pneuma. He uses the same word. Nowadays, if you read that in English, you'd probably read the wind blows where it wills. That is the way of the spirit. So wind has to become a metaphor for spirit. But I think Van Gogh here sort of helps us to reach back to a time where wind, spirit, and maybe even your breath that comes out of you as you look at the picture can be seen as part of the one phenomenon again. And in a way, that is what Barfield encourages us to think about in our times, the stage that we've got to. And people like Van Gogh perhaps are in the vanguard of that. But we need to understand more, because there's meaning to the evolution of consciousness, which is absolutely crucial to try to get to grips with. It's not just a return. It's a re-emergence, I think. And that's what, particularly, I think the Christian story can tell when understood in this way. And I feel that perhaps we need to try and understand it that way now. So here's another way of putting it in more abstract terms. He thought that consciousness broadly moves from what he called original participation. So this is around about 3,000 years ago, where life he imagined was experienced in a completely immersive way. People moved, as it were, through flows of meaning, and that the task in life was to discover your sense of self from the outside in, primarily, and that myths, religious rituals, the whole way of life was organized one way or another around that. He can get more nuanced about it, but I've felt it's quite helpful just to get the sense of life moving from the outside in at this stage. It goes through cycles where this sense of participation withdraws into the individual. And this leads both to a sense of alienation, there's crises of meaning, which you can track through periods of time, but also as an intensification of what it is to be an individual. And the idea is that that new life that's discovered within leads to the possibility of what he called a reciprocal participation, or for now, the possibility even of what he called final participation. And by final, I think he just meant he meant final in the teleological sense of the direction in which we're headed, rather than sort of once and for all. But the word reciprocal captures it almost better for me, I think. And the broad idea there is that by knowing the richness of your own inner life, that enables you freely to see the richness of the inside of the whole world, as he put it. Spiritual perception moves from the inside out, connects with the outside, and inspiration comes in that way. And the point is that it's now known more freely than it was before, perhaps. To cut to the chase, I think perhaps the great gift that Christianity really constellated was the sense that you can be an individual and engage in the spiritual quest, know the divine. That hadn't been quite formulated or experienced, felt before. But Christendom, I think, was founded upon the idea of this reciprocal participation, which I'll try and unpack. We've experienced a withdrawal of participation now in our own times, and so we're trying to find some sort of reciprocity or this teleological move once again, which I'll come to at the end. So that's the broad move. Now let me sort of track it and see whether you can feel it too, because this is the important thing. If you go back to the origins of the story of Israel, ancient Hebrew consciousness, you'll know that it originates with this sense of discontent with Egyptian consciousness. All the stories about fleeing from Egypt across the Red Sea, the liberation, let my people go, and so on. And whatever the historicity of that, I think the deep spiritual truth is that the people of Israel were one of those groups, I think the Greeks had it too, which I'll come to, but they were one of the groups that kind of got itchy feet about this consciousness from the outside in that was so tremendously manifest in Egyptian civilization, ancient Egyptian civilization. It is felt in pantheistic notions. So here we have the one individual standing before many gods. And I think that one way of understanding that is to remember that in Egyptian art, body parts are often seen floating free. Here's the Eye of Horus, but you can see knees, you can see chests, you can see noses. And it's one of the points where we start to perhaps think that we're looking at a different kind of consciousness when we stood before ancient Egyptian art. You know, what is the mind that made this, and what was it trying to communicate? My sense is that different body parts in this milieu where you knew yourself from the outside in, different body parts resonated particularly with different deities. So the Eye of Horus here is called that for this very reason, that Horus is a dying and rising god, and seeing is a kind of awakening. And so it was natural to associate it with the movement of Horus in the cosmos. That's, as it were, how you experienced your sight. And you would have had devotion to Horus, libations and so on, to try and tune your sight, you might say. We would do it very differently now. I'm also very fascinated by why the ancient Egyptians started building pyramids fairly early on in their civilization. This is all my sort of speculation. Barfield doesn't quite talk about this, but it sort of gives the background. But as the psychotherapist in me notices pyramids and immediately thinks of modern psychology, which has very naturally turned to pyramids to understand our inner life. The most famous of them is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he describes as a pyramid with at the base the basic needs that we have of security and sustenance and so on. And then as you go up the pyramid, you rise up more and more sort of rarefied needs until you reach self-actualization at the top. And my sense is that perhaps in ancient Egypt, that this was known from the outside in. We know that the pyramids now weren't built by slaves, they were built by free men, maybe free men and women, and that it was a sort of a manifestation of the collective sense of the society at the time, where people gathered themselves through the pharaoh, through the person who, as it were, was at the pinnacle of society, and that the pharaoh's connection with the divine was very much part of their own sense of connection with the gods as well. So it made sense to build pyramids and to organize, as it were, your whole economy around the construction of these things. That's what this notion has told me anyway, suggests to me. Slightly more tangibly, when we move into the ancient consciousness of the Greeks here, in Homer's Iliad, this is an image of Achilles about to strike Agamemnon, and Achilles doesn't do it because he has a crisis of conscience or thinks better of the situation as you or I might, something that happens within. For him, in the story, Athena appears and pulls back his head and stops him doing it, which is shown in this image here. So he's somehow engaging with his life through interactions with the gods known from the outside in. And if you read both the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll know that that's the kind of thing that happens. Also in Homer, in the Iliad, in the Greek, Achilles, for example, himself doesn't say run across the battlefield. It says things like his knees ran across the battlefield. And he doesn't put his armor on himself, he puts his armor on his skin. And he wrestles with his gut, his thumos in his belly, and things like this. And so there's this sense of how in the time people experience themselves as these kind of spirited factions. There's no word for body, living body in ancient Greek. The word soma back then just meant corpse, when the spirited factions had left and you were just left with the empty sort of body. So I think that this is where you start to get the more tangible evidence that Barfield picked up on too, that this is so. When we move into the Hebrew tradition, I think this is a way of understanding the oldest bits of the Bible, these old stories and myths that get kind of transmitted and then written down, which nowadays many Christians struggle with. Here's Caravaggio's depiction of Abraham about to slay Isaac, his son, and the angel appearing and saying, there's a ram in the thicket. Now, for us now, this has provoked lots of tremendously rich, actually, as well as troubled exploration of what it might mean to be faithful to God. And I think the story is remembered because it comes from a time where Abraham knew what to do because the angel appeared and told him from the outside in. That's how he, as it were, engaged with the divine life, very much from the sense of the outside in. And the story gets remembered because it becomes troubling. And so it becomes a story, a transitional story, as the psychotherapist would put it, that facilitates a kind of change, a struggle. And so right from the earliest times, you get this sense that awakening is linked to anxiety, is linked to trouble, is linked to struggle. Because you're not just being told something that, as it were, you might know already, just joining a couple more dots. You're being invited already into a new experience of God and the divine. And that can only come about through a sense of withdrawal or alienation, which these kind of stories capture for us. Here's another tremendous story, Jacob wrestling with the angel. And with that wonderful line at the end of it where Jacob says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Now we think of that as a kind of inner wrestling with God, quite naturally. Jacob, his hip is dislocated as a result of the story. It was something very external outside for him at the time, as the story's remembered. And we might read that metaphorically in some way now. But these stories capture something of the old dispensation. Here's an image, if you can just about make it out, which tells of one of the ancient battles in the oldest parts of the Bible. And again, this kind of scene is replicated in ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, where the people experience the battle not just as themselves, gathering their courage, stepping out, and with a good strategy, hopefully defeating the enemy. The stories always say that Mount Zion trembled when Israel stepped forth, that the rivers and streams joined forth, but joined the forces as well, and fought the enemy too. You get this in Homer. Achilles has to fight river gods as well as Trojans. And I think, again, this captures something of the real experience, and also how they understood what was going on. Jeremy, in his books, has called this mythic history, where you understood what was going on in the here and now, not by, as it were, gathering the evidence and trying to say, at 12 o'clock this happened, then by 3 they'd taken this move and so on, which is our way of doing history now. You understood history by trying to understand how what was going on earth was a reflection of divine history, of what was going on in the heavens. That was where truth lay. And so you get that captured in these kind of stories. Again, consciousness from the outside in. Another representation of that, this is an old tomb which is being discovered in modern-day Israel. But it reaches back to the times when people wanted to be buried in ancestral lands. And this speaks, I think, to how life after death was imagined. That it was a returning to the ancestors, which is why clan burial, sacred land and so on was so very, very important. Because you experienced your life, I think, as kind of rising momentarily into a kind of mortal existence and then returning to some sort of immortal existence where you return to the ancestors. And so this was ritually very significant to be buried in the right tomb, in the right sacred land. And also the occasional stories that are in ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew literature about people who go to the underworld, they always feature encounters with spirits who are kind of fading fast, who are disappearing. They're called shades quite often for that reason. There wasn't a sense of individual afterlife because there wasn't really a sense of the individual at the time. That comes and becomes very important in Christianity. So this is something of the background of the oldest parts of the Bible particularly. Now things start to change in what's now known as the period of the exiles. This is something which Barfield picks up on, and when I was writing my book about him, I decided that I needed to see whether this could really stand up, given the scholarship which has happened, not so much since he died. And I did my theology in the 1980s, and he died in the 1970s, and Saving the Appearance was written a bit before. But there's a lot of scholarship around about this, and so I wanted to see whether Barfield's ideas still stand up. And it was real joy to discover that it does, in fact. And this was one of the moments of great just discovery I had, which was when I was in the British Library and trying to work out how I could tell how people engaged with literature in this exilic period. So we're talking about the sort of 6th and 7th centuries BC. If you know the biblical history, you'll know that, first of all, the northern kingdom is taken into exile when the Assyrians come and capture the northern territories. And then a few decades later, Judah is captured and taken into capture by the Babylonians. And what happens in between is that Jerusalem increases very significantly in size. It becomes a proper city-state rather than just the biggest settlement in a more rural kingdom of Judah as it had been before. And it turns out that there's now very good evidence that Hezekiah promoted literacy very dramatically in this period. Literacy rose, it's thought now, from almost nothing, just the very small scribal class, to a community where about 20% of the population could read. A very, very dramatic increase in reading. It's thought that Hezekiah did it because people had lost touch with the land. They'd lost touch with the source of the old stories that gave them a sense of who they were. And so they needed to be written down in the new city-state in order they could be rehearsed and maintain the sense of cohesion, particularly for a very dramatically expanding city. But this has the unexpected side effect that it changes people's religiosity. Because writing is very, very different from oral traditions. When you have to read a word, you have to conjure something up inside you in order to bring the words back to life. It's a very personal, intimate kind of activity. Whereas with an oral tradition that you discovered, as it were, connected to rituals in the land, making the pilgrimages, feeling it perhaps more through the seasons of the year and so on, this is given to you much more from the outside in. That's where the myths are remembered. So this attempt by Hezekiah in a way to maintain control and cohesion has this unexpected side effect that it starts to shift people's consciousness. They're alienated from the land, but they start perhaps to discover a new consciousness from within. Now, burial practices changed too at the time because you couldn't be buried in the sacred lands anymore. And in fact, in order to bolster the power of the temple in Jerusalem and make that the center of people's devotions, you read repeatedly that the good kings of Israel sort of destroy the old sacred lands. They take down the old pillars and they cut down trees and things. But again, this has a kind of unexpected side effect that burials have to be now performed in family tombs in the city. And again, there's now very good evidence that family tombs and even individual burials that practice starts from this time. And again, that dramatically changes people's religiosity. Because, as it were, you're launched out into whatever happens next, not by automatically joining the ancestors, but with this slight hiatus. Where are you going if you're not being buried in the sacred land? And so, again, this sense of alienation starts to, as it were, make you wonder about your own salvation, perhaps, you might say, with this new burial practice. When burial practices change, it's a very dramatic thing to do. It calls a lot into question, particularly what might happen next and how it might happen. And this is gathered together in this period by the Deuteronomists. It's known as the Deuteronomic reform in biblical scholarship. And again, this scholarship very much substantiates what Barfield was saying. And what they do in particular is they shift focus from the older tales of the patriarchs to do with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and move attention very, very much to Moses, shown here before the burning bush, taking off his shoes before the burning bush. And I think they pick up on old stories of Moses, particularly the encounter with God before the burning bush, where God reveals himself as I am. And they also tell the tale of exile from Egypt, moving from the old consciousness, you might say, and make it absolutely clear that Moses is not a king. And they sort of do it in the most blatant ways. So you'll know that Moses never enters the promised land. He can never have become a king, even if, as it were, the people wanted him to. And then it also says that no one knows his burial place to this day. it's sort of left hanging. Where does he go to? This is a new kind of religious figure, focusing on exile and wilderness and alienation. He's a much more vividly painted figure as well than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They have their ups and downs, but Moses spends nearly his whole time complaining, saying he's not up to it. And Yahweh has to kind of constantly reassure him. And there's a real sense of struggle in Moses' story that you don't quite get before. And the Deuteronomists, I think, land on this to put together the Deuteronomic texts. And I think that what they do is that they're writing a kind of manual that would foster spiritual change. So it's not just in the stories about Moses, but a lot of the law itself, I think, is a kind of almost like a meditation that, if you really engage with it, might cultivate a new sense of interiority and begin to cultivate a new sense of the divine within. And it's pretty dramatic. In Deuteronomy, the law changes so that, for example, rather than sins falling upon the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation, Deuteronomy says, no, you must take responsibility for your sin yourself. And he does it, the writers of the Deuteronomic text do it to such an extent that they say, if your father or your brother or sister tell you what to do, you should stone them. This is how dramatic it gets. There's this sort of sense of a very, very new dispensation coming through, both with the stories, particularly around Moses, and also with details of the law. I could go on about this at great length. It was very exciting for me to start to read Deuteronomy in this way, and I put it together in the book to try and make the case. So you have this sense of Israel in the middle part of the first millennia discovering a new kind of spirituality. I think it's why Judaism survives the exiles. And when Cyrus becomes the king of Babylon and invites the people of Israel to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, many don't, in fact. They almost don't quite see the point anymore. Many actually go back to Egypt. But enough do, and the temple is rebuilt, and it enters the Second Temple period too. So this really was a very, very dramatic change. They start to call themselves Jews for the first time, a kind of ethnicity rather than a people associated with a land. Now, the same sort of thing starts to happen in the Greek context. I'm going to just capture one element of this for now and talk particularly about the sculptures of the Greek awakening, as Gombrich called it in his History of Art. It's very well described in that sense, because within a century, Greek art completely changes. It moves from these older, what we would now say is archetypal figures. This is not like Jim and Jane from next door. These are the archetype of a man, the archetype of a woman, and they're sculpted according to sacred ratios. The body parts, for example, are always presented in this way with these distances between them, standards that actually were used in ancient Egypt as well as in ancient Greece. And so I think when you stood before these, manhood or womanhood, as it were, was speaking before you and was cultivating that from within you in this sense. Again, this sort of movement from the outside in. But very quickly, just within a few decades, things start to change, and you can go to museums like the British Museum and feel this consciousness almost waking up before your eyes as you move around the sculptures that they have there. Knees start to bend. People start to be shown with the tools of their trade. Little upturns are put in the corner of mouths. And this chap here, he's clearly been to the gym to make his body look like that. This is not sacred ratios anymore. Until eventually you have the powerful sense of individuality in these sculptures. Just a few decades later, the very famous Discobolus of Myron there, and then the figure on the right is a Hellenistic queen. And these figures, in their different ways, are both telling you about the kind of mental, the psychic power almost of these individuals, not just about their beautiful bodies, although their bodies are very beautiful indeed. The Discobolus has undergone an extraordinary psychological training, we would now say. And the queen there is showing you about her presence, which if it walked into the room would stun you. This is something which is coming very powerfully from the inside out now, not from the outside in. And you can track these changes through the plays of the same century, the 5th century BC, through Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and particularly through philosophy as well. This is how I first got onto Barfield, to try and understand Plato, which I just felt I never did when I did my PhD. And you'll know that Socrates makes a name for himself asking questions. When I did my PhD, I was told that Socrates was a good analytical philosopher and was looking for definitions. I realize now this was just profoundly mistaken, that he was asking questions because he wanted you to ask this little question, why? And if you ask that little question, why, you have to move into this doubt, this apophatic space, you might say, and cultivate an answer that's working with you and the outside world around you, you and the gods. Socrates' own divinity and the demon that he felt was sent from Apollo never told him what to do once in a positive sense. It always told him what not to do. In Plato and other documents of the time as well testify to this. And so this is a guidance that makes the next move fall on you. You've got to cultivate your sense with the deity in order to know what to do next. Not, as it were, have your head yanked back like Athena did to Achilles anymore. So this same sort of movement in its different ways is unfolding in the ancient Greek world too. Now it comes together with Alexander the Great, when Hellenistic Judaism is born in particular. This was something I didn't know about hardly at all, actually. When I did my theology in the 1980s, it was barely mentioned. But it's in this period that apocalypticism really gets going. It's half hinted at in the bits of the Hebrew Bible, but really gets going in the intertestamental and apocalyptic material. Texts like Ezekiel the Tragedian I'd never read before. A tremendous text. And I think it's partly driven because if you have this emerging sense of individuality, and then you look at the world around you, you realize that individuals who are evil in this life seem to live well. So it prompts the question, what about us who are trying to live good lives? And so one answer to that is the sense that divine justice must return at some future point, where the good go to enjoy their reward, whereas the evil get their comeuppance. And this develops both in the Hebrew world and also in the Greek world too. The stories about judgment and so on start to shift and change. So, for example, Plato actually records this. He says that people knew at one stage when they were going to die. They knew the day and when they were going to die. But that didn't matter because everything came from the outside in. But when things started to change, Zeus realized he had to withhold the time of death from people because they were becoming canny and they could live terrible lives until the last day and reform at the last moment. And so the stories of the afterlife start to change and judgments start to change there. Another very dramatic shift in the intertestamental period is the birth of the synagogue. There are no synagogues in the Hebrew Bible. They're all over the place if you're a Christian in the New Testament. And they're a very Hellenistic kind of invention, because what the synagogue is about is going with your local community to study the text and become a good Jew, as it were, by yourself, with others to show you the way, but cultivate a sense of what it is to be a Jew by yourself, and becomes the sort of dominant practice, and then you went to the temple perhaps at other times. Some sects, by the time of Jesus, even stopped going to the temple, and they feel that this cultivating a sense of yourself is the key task. So this has sort of got going within Hellenistic Judaism, this wonderful kind of syncretistic coming together of both Hellenism and Judaism. It's fought about too, of course, and there's a rich story to tell, which is you can now read in quite good summaries. But if you're a Christian, it starts to speak that the time is right. It's the kairos moment, as it puts it in the New Testament. And the figure of Jesus is born into this moment. And I think that at the heart of what Christianity needs to discover is that Jesus constellated a sense of his own I amness that was so completely human, even to the point of knowing death, that it could reflect fully, with complete transparency, the divine I amness that had originally been shown to Moses in the burning bush and struggled with for all these centuries. It finally could be understood. Because in a way, you can only understand the unity of the divine, the monotheistic God, the God that can say, I am, if you've got enough of a sense of your own I amness to kind of mirror or capture that. You need to be able to participate enough in the divine oneness to appreciate that there is such a thing as divine oneness. And monotheism becomes the kind of appealing way of understanding the divine, therefore. It's a knowledge that you can share, as Malcolm was saying before, and Barfield and others very, very clearly picked up on. And I love this icon because I think it captures that sense of it. If you kind of look at it and think, the bit that, as it were, is most fully in this world, you might say, alone, is perhaps the Bible, the book. It's a tangible material object. And then the icon just moves through a slight sweep to the other hands that's showing the blessing. This kind of blessings are transitional things. They connect worlds. They're symbols. And then that sweeps up a bit further to the face, the place that sees. And this is now not just a kind of floating body part. It's a joint eyes. One's human, one's divine. So Jesus, the figure, is seen with both human and divine eyes. If you know the icon, you know that the smaller eye is the human one, the slightly darker one, the larger one that's slightly in darkness is the divine eye. It's coming together in this person. This is a person who's both fully human and fully divine. And then it sweeps up, as it were, further into the halo, which has the Greek hoon written into it, the one. So this, I think, is the significance of Jesus. I've been persuaded again through the biblical scholarship that Jesus knew this in his own life. I think you can go so far as to say that now with fairly reasonable scholarly justification. And people sensed that in him and so became fixated upon him and wanted to know it for themselves. And so Jesus starts to teach this, you might say. Now, another thing which I tried to work out was what was distinctive about Jesus' teaching. Because in a way, if this is historically the case, what Barfield and others have proposed, then you need to be able to at least make a reasonable case that Jesus had distinctive aspects to his teaching that tried to communicate it. Nowadays, if you go to church, the sort of social and moral side of Christianity will probably be the default teaching of Jesus that you get. So love thy neighbour and so on. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. It's absolutely necessary. But I don't think it's remotely distinctive. Plato has Socrates say, what use is it if you love your friends? The really remarkable virtue is to love your enemies. This is kind of standard morality, I think, by the time of Jesus, which is why it's there. But there are distinctive features of Jesus. And I think if Christianity is going to try and capture its mystical core again, it needs to focus much, much more on the distinctive aspects, rather than in a way preaching the easy stuff. It's important stuff, but it's relatively easy because it's become part of the spiritual air we breathe and doesn't require us really to wrestle with it anymore. We constantly feel guilty about not living up to these moral ideals, but we kind of know what the moral ideals are. But if there's going to be a real shift of consciousness, we have to struggle with something that we don't really understand yet. Now, I think the distinctive aspects of Jesus' teaching come across in three ways. One are the parables. Jesus, it's recorded over 40 parables, I think, in the Gospels. Paul, for example, doesn't teach in any parables at all. So I think parables are something that Jesus kind of created to try and help people wrestle with this new consciousness and as it were, awaken the incarnation in themselves, which I think was the real point. And parables, as it were, work on the four levels. These are the levels that medieval Christianity put together to understand parables. So there's the literal level, first of all. So if you take a parable like the Good Samaritan, one very well known, there's the literal level. The Good Samaritan helps the man who's been attacked. And you might rest at that point. You might think, good old moral parable, I hope I do it myself when I see someone, in the street, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's all that you get out of the Good Samaritan, then you don't get a shift of consciousness. The next step in this schema is the allegorical meaning, the other meaning. So you're starting to think, but wait a minute, is there another meaning here? You're put into this slight sense of withdrawal or alienation. It may not be obvious that this is the case in the Good Samaritan, but in a lot of the parables, they're clearly not moral. In fact, if you try and read them as moral parables, you think they're actually amoral or just not interested in morality at all. There's the unjust judge and the unjust steward and all sorts of, the judge that won't open the door to the widow and all sorts of bizarre things going on. These are prompting you that there's another meaning. If you wrestle with that enough, there's what they call the tropological moment, from tropos to turn. And this is where your heart starts to, as it were, move, and you think, goodness me, is this parable actually communicating something completely different from me, which I didn't even know about before? And then you get into the anagogical moment with the parables, where a new consciousness is awakening inside you. It's borrowed from the Platonic idea of ascending, where the divine, as it were, is awoken inside you as you ascend more towards the divine. And I think, broadly speaking, the parables move you from the sort of perhaps moral, if it seems like it can be read in a moral way, to one where your consciousness is freed to know the divine. And one could go through the parables. I do some of them in my book, but to show that they're broadly trying to get you to cultivate a shift of consciousness through wrestling with them, through the way they disturb you. Another part of Jesus' teaching we think is quite distinctive is his interiority. here's a little bit from Matthew's Gospel. When you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut the door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. There's only one prayer, which is public prayer in Jesus, that's recorded in Jesus from Jesus' own mouth, and that's the one that's best known, the Our Father. But all the others talk about going into rooms, being in secret. Your Father will be there. Don't let your left hand know what the right hand's doing. Again, it's really trying to get you to focus on this interiority, I think. And then you find the reward. Another way in which it happens is that Jesus has these slightly odd preoccupations with what's coming out of a person, not what's going into them. Not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a man. And then the same kind of intimation, the same sense, I think, is reflected in sayings like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now, this is no doubt partly about not being too puritanical with the law and so on. But I think it's pointing to, as well, this very profound shift of consciousness, that it's not coming from the outside in anymore. What really counts is what's coming from the inside out. And that's why what comes out of a mouth defiles a man. This is the new test. Things that are hidden in secret will be claimed from the rooftops, Jesus said, the same kind of idea. And then perhaps the most common remark that Jesus uses that comes from Isaiah, the troubled prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, is these riffs on, have they got the eyes to see? Have they got the ears to hear? Here it's put in the positive way, blessed are your eyes for they see, and your ears because they hear. He's constantly going on about this. This is about an awakening, about a shift of consciousness, and then you get the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So I think this is the kind of distinctive teaching of Jesus. A more controversial area, but I think it can be made just to stand up, just about is his apocalyptic reform. I think that Jesus realized that the kingdom wasn't coming, but the kingdom of God was already within people. So here is one of the relatively rare moments where Luke records Jesus saying this. Now, when he was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, very standard question in first century Judaism, when is the kingdom of God going to come? He answered them and said, the kingdom of God does not come with observation, nor will they say, see here or see there. For indeed, the kingdom of God is within you. And I think this was probably the most difficult sort of tangible teaching of Jesus in the early Christian period, which is why the Gospels and Paul too contain quite a lot of apocalyptic material. So perhaps the earliest bit of the New Testament is 1 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about, don't worry that some have died, we'll be gathered together in the clouds and join them before we all go to heaven. But Paul sort of changed his tune through his letters, that you can almost see an evolution of consciousness going on in Paul, which maybe in the divine wisdom is why these letters were sort of preserved. Because later on, he's starting to say, actually, I understand that the mind of Christ is within me. I've taken it on. And he sort of lessens the apocalyptic stuff and starts to talk much more about what's going on in the here and now and why that matters. So I think that this was a genuine kind of way that the earliest Christian tradition tried to wrestle with the real meaning of Jesus. They recorded these sayings because they knew Jesus said them, even though they didn't understand them. And then they sort of recorded other ones, or they half remembered other ones that get sort of in the mix as well. But there is, of course, one gospel where there's no apocalyptic material, which is John's gospel, normally thought to be the latest gospel. And my guess is that by that stage, John, for example, could quite straightforwardly write Jesus saying, I am this, I am the other, I am something else, I am the bread of life, and so on. Because by then, his community at least had understood that this was the meaning of Jesus, that our I amness can reflect the divine I amness, that the incarnation can be born inside us as well. It's there as well where, Jesus says there are truths which are too difficult to bear and so on. It feels very much like a gospel that's looking to a different kind of future than an apocalyptic future. And then the final bit, which I quite like, are these resurrection appearances. So the sense that something's got to happen inside us now. Here's one of the resurrection appearances where Jesus encounters Mary encounters Jesus in the garden, and Jesus says to her, Mary. She turns to him and said, Rabboni, which is to say teacher. Really significant because, of course, a teacher fosters something in you, and a teacher initiates something in you. And he says to her, do not cling to me. Now, how tough is that? That's, not quite as bad as saying stone your brother. But after all that trauma, Jesus saying to Mary, do not cling to me. What would that have been like And then he says, but I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. There's something democratizing going on. This is now your experience too. Of course, the crucifixion comes, this really crucial step to get this right, because scenes of solitariness, alienation, withdrawal, death itself are a crucial part of this process. To put it slightly too easily now, but using this sort of psychotherapeutic insight that a sort of small self has to die in order that a bigger self can be realized. And again, putting it slightly glibly, but I think that Jesus had to die this way to absolutely make that short, that clear. I slightly got this from Dante, because when Dante goes into paradise and he gets to the heaven of Mars, he learns that the crucifixion, God didn't need it. It was done because people needed it, to kind of get something into their skulls, as it were. That was the love that he realizes in the heaven of Mars, that God, as it were, was prepared to do that. But I think that the crucifixion became such a pivotal part of Christian spirituality because it absolutely secures this sense that you've got to die to yourself, you've got to take up your cross. As Paul puts it, be crucified daily, in order that you don't just easily identify yourself with the divine. But when that happens, you see divine life. And I love this picture by Piero della Francesca because for me it captures it very well. The poor stereotype Roman soldiers, their eyes are not seeing, their ears are not hearing, even though nothing less than the transformation of the whole cosmos, as it were, is happening right beside them. The dead tree is turning into a living tree. The picture's been restored now in Umbria, and you can see how the vivid colours of it. But those who do have the eyes to see and the ears to hear do see the resurrected Jesus. And again, the psychologist in me wonders whether the reason why the resurrection stories in the New Testament are so odd, that Jesus appears, then disappears, he does this, then doesn't do that. He's walking with them for hours and they don't see him, and then they do see him, and then he disappears again. It's a bit like if you play with a child the game peekaboo. Do you see me now, you don't, kind of thing. And the reason why that game is such an important game is because it cultivates a sense of being able to hold the parent's presence within you, so that you can learn that when the parent leaves the room, life hasn't ended. And I think that perhaps the resurrection stories can be interpreted in that way too. They're not evidence in a literal sense. This is one of the disastrous routes that modern Christianity takes, tries to make out that somehow it happened in a literal way. I think you completely miss the point, and it just spirals down into spiritual eyes closing and ears shutting once more. We need to understand it in this different way, which people like Barfield help me to understand anyway. Now, this is not where we're at now. Let me just explain how this kind of develops through Christendom, very, very briefly. Here's the figure of Evagrius Ponticus, one of the first sort of mappers of interiority, you might say, in the Christian tradition. He comes up with what he calls the sort of the 8 difficult experiences. They turned, unfortunately, into the 7 deadly sins. But he says that if you go on this interior journey, you will discover gluttony, you will discover guilt, you will discover anger, you will discover pride, even worse. But as it were, don't worry. That is the way. This is the dying. And his teachings were about how to navigate that way. Nature and the world around us starts to be interpreted in this reciprocal way, and the pelican in her piety becomes a very important way of doing that. And this is seen at these various levels, that there's the pelican, literally, it was thought, who plucks her breast to feed the young. That was a bit of natural history. But it also speaks to you in a sort of moral way, an allegorical way, that we're asked to give part of our life to others. But it also speaks a cosmic truth, a divine truth to you, that God constantly is pouring out his life into creation, that you can even see in the pelican in her piety. And when you see the pelican doing this, you're also experiencing the divine life coming to you. You're participating in that way, this reciprocal kind of experience. And this image becomes very, very popular. It develops into full-blown mysticism. Here's Hildegard seeing how the human mind can traverse nothing less than the whole cosmos, because it can participate in the divine life too. And then Meister Eckhart also picks up on this very, very clearly, I think. And he can make these remarks like, my eye and God's eye is one eye and one sight and one knowledge and one love. That is the profundity of the reciprocity that he experienced. And Icahart also remarks at one point, the incarnation that really matters is not the one that happened 1,500 years ago. He doesn't quite put it like that. But, it's the one that's happening now in your soul now. I think the last kind of gasp of this is the Renaissance. When we see Renaissance images now, we feel a kind of full consciousness. The Mona Lisa, very famous, of course, endless discussion about who she was, what she was feeling, is she smiling, is she not? Her interiority, with the genius of Leonardo captured, you can't put it down. It wrestles something out of you, your own interior response to it. And then with this very familiar trope from Renaissance pictures too, that the landscape's doing it as well. There's these curvy roads and moving rivers and disappearing to infinite horizons. The landscape has an interiority as well. I particularly like this figure, the painting by Ghirlandaio of the old man and his grandson. You might ask why Ghirlandaio put the warty nose smack bang in the middle of the picture. And he's saying this is a particular moment that's also a universal moment where the meeting of these two figures, this very touching meeting of these two figures, you feel their interiority again, very, 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 very lovely way. But it's also a timeless movement of the heavens almost. So hence you look out of the window and see nature and the sky there as well. This sense of reciprocity in the Renaissance imagery. But it changes, and we come to the modern world and a new kind of withdrawal. So it happens broadly in three ways. I'll just run through this fairly quickly now, because you perhaps know about it as well. It's quite commonly rehearsed. The scientific revolution, of course. 1543 is the date that Copernicus publishes on the revolution of spheres. Before then, it was quite natural to depict the human figure moving through the earth, moving through the celestial spheres, being part of them. Afterwards, it becomes possible to depict the heavens in the way that is on the right, where if you notice, it's not just that the sun is in the center of things. Actually, that was an idea that was countenanced for a long, long time. It was in the ancient Greek world as well. But what happened with Copernicus is that human consciousness shifted enough that human beings could imagine themselves outside of the cosmos entirely in order that they could develop the mathematics to formalize the idea that the sun was at the center of things, and then as that developed through the scientific revolution. But of course it leaves the great problem that how are you going to get back into the cosmos? How are you going to participate with life once more? Especially when you've got this great gain of science. It's a bit of a Faustian pact. The Reformation picks up on this too. The figures here of Martin Luther and Calvin. They too become hugely suspicious of inner life and also hugely suspicious of allegorical readings of nature. Calvin famously calls it the depravity of inner life. Martin Luther writes about how he struggled for years to try and give up the allegorical readings of nature. One of the most troubling experiences of his life was when he was caught in a thunderstorm, and he worried for the rest of his life that he'd been bewitched. And he felt he only gained some relief from that when he realized that nature wasn't bewitched. And so he struggled to withdraw from nature. And it sets up this sort of struggle which certainly characterizes Christian lives now, that the truth of things is found in the Bible, they concluded, this kind of external reference point, again, hoping they might discover some truth moving from the outside in once more. But of course, the way that that's validated is by the truth being perceived by the individual. And so unwittingly, I think perhaps, they set up a new kind of oscillation, a new struggle, where you turn to the text, but have to discern what's true in the text yourself. And so Protestantism very naturally fragments, because there's endless discussions about this. That's the downside. The upside is it also makes for a new kind of interiority, a new sense of what it is to be an individual, and the potential that the individual can know the divine once more. It also happens with the Enlightenment, just to complete the picture. Here's Kant famously saying, don't trust received authority, dare to know by your own reason. There's a whole story one could tell about that, but it goes on at the same sort of time. So we're left now with this new kind of sense of struggle. And it has its upside and it has its downside. The upside, I think, the downside is the sense of alienation, the struggle with meaning, the the way that the universe is quite naturally perceived in a mechanical way. Jeremy's written about this many times, and others have too. Perhaps it's familiar to you. But there are upsides, and I think that Barfield's real key message is that we must try and work out what the gift is of this alienation and learn to discern it, to incorporate it, rather than try and return to a sort of pre-modern world, to regress. Because if we try and do that, not only does it never really work, but also we don't participate in this continual unfolding that he tracked with the evolution of consciousness. And if you're a Christian, I think you miss the calling of Christianity now. And I put up here images of homos before Homo sapiens, because I think one of the things that Barfield realized is that Darwinian evolution, which in many parts of the Christian world is painted as the great enemy, has really got something for spirituality as well, which is the sense that spirituality too evolves. And it evolves in very, very dramatic ways. It's not just, as it were, length of time that Christianity has got to come to terms with, that was tracked through geology, but the fact that consciousness itself changes quite as dramatically as species emerging. You'll know, if you know anything about Barfield, you know that he became very interested in Rudolf Steiner once he had this realization himself. And I think part of the reason why he got interested in Rudolf Steiner is he felt that Steiner saw this aspect of spiritual evolution more profoundly than Barfield did himself. But Steiner has these clairvoyant abilities. I've struggled with Steiner. I still struggle with Steiner. That's going to be part of my ongoing struggle, I think. So I don't talk about Steiner in my book, but I think this is part of, as well as the new sense of reciprocal participation in the individual, I think the challenge of evolution, maybe even bigger, that's hardly begun in spiritual journeys, is there for us as well. How do we do that? How do we go about it? Well, I think the first thing to do is to think about your own inner life. I might say that because I'm a psychotherapist. Here's Freud's couch. But I think what happens is if you get to grips enough with your own inner life, it doesn't just have these kind of therapeutic benefit where you maybe ease up on a couple of your neuroses, but you also start to realize that there's more space inside you than perhaps you had first thought. To put it in a slightly technical way, you're not constantly projecting your inner life onto others, but you're realizing that others have a life of their own within you, and so you can move from, as it were, resisting and trying to keep at bay to relating and incorporating. So therapy, when it moves just beyond the pure clinical therapeutic release, becomes a spiritual journey as well, because you learn to relate to your dreams, as it were, to realize they've got something to tell you, not just disturb you out of your sort of current neuroses. So I think that however you do it, psychotherapy is my way chiefly, that learning about your own inner life is the first crucial step. You've got to do that, I think. Then you can start to notice that time is experienced in very, very different ways. This is something, again, which I kind of awoke to in my psychotherapy, that I realized that there were parts of me, for example, that were actually timeless, that things that happened to me way, way back in my history, before I was conscious of them, were quite as alive today as they were back then. And they don't sort of fall off with time in their intensity. And whilst this was troubling for me at first, its gift was that I realized that perhaps there's something timeless that I can experience directly. And of course, eternity is one of the qualities of God. I put this image, one of Blake's rather lovely images of Dante rising up through purgatory here. And one of the things that starts to happen through purgatory and paradise is that time starts to shift its meaning for Dante. So I think when you get these glimpses of a new quality of time, they're really important to hold on to and amplify, because they're suggesting that you're moving, as it were, in the right direction with this new kind of participation. I think that we start to experience the natural world around us differently as well. I put an image of trees on the slide because trees seem to be one of the ways that our wider culture is starting to do this. Endless books about trees, the secret life of trees. I read an article in a newspaper the other day that was asking, how do trees experience time? Now, that article would not have got even commissioned, I'd say even 5 years ago. So there is hope. And the more mystical writers like Thomas Traherne, one of our really important mystics, I think, in this country, in the English-speaking world, who saw this, I think, quite clearly, was one of his best-known lines, which I can't quite read from here: "You never enjoy the world aright till the sea itself floweth in your veins." he wrote his poetry, I think, partly to cultivate this sense of it. So look for these intimations as well. I think miracles and the paranormal and angels and all this kind of this chaos of supernatural experience, which doesn't die, and the minute you start looking, you realize it's all over the place. This really matters as well. Here's another Blake image. If you want to get a taste of this and never seen an angel yourself, then go to the Blake exhibition at Tate Britain, which is massive. And I'm glad it's massive because you get overwhelmed by it. But if you allow yourself to sort of stay with the images, then they can begin perhaps to catalyze a sense of something different. It's quite disturbing. A lot of Blake's images are quite disturbing, but that you start to realize is part of the journey. So synchronicities, all the rest of it, starting to try not just to treat them as kind of spooky and exceptional and odd, although they can feel like that. They're calling you to understand them yourselves, to discern them, and to bring your own sense of yourself in relation to them, that they can become more part of your life, in fact, I think. It's a kind of reflexive process. I'm nearing towards the end. Growth matters massively as well. Here's one of Monica Beisner's rather lovely images of Dante in the highest heavens now. We've got to reconceive growth from accumulation, which is how it shapes the modern economy, of course, thinking about it in material terms, to thinking about it in spiritual terms. You know, maybe growth can be thought about it in terms of discovery. I did the reading group with the Constellations of Philosophy earlier in the year with Jeremy, which the Temenos Academy ran, and one of the things which came across very clearly to me there was that Boethius realizes that growth is about discovering what he already possesses, not trying to find and possess and, as it were, hold on to more and more. That's part of his awakening. So cultivating that sense of things matters not just to us as individuals, matters very, very dramatically to our economy. A new sense of freedom. Here is an image of the Good Samaritan by Van Gogh, and this sense that it's not actually about the moral demand. The point is the Good Samaritan was free to act, and then he did the good thing. If we can shift our sense of freedom from ease of choice, more and more choice, to perhaps ease of action, so that we can just move freely through the world, that is going to be a key thing as well, I think. We've got to tackle pluralism. We've got to realize, again, as Dante does in here, the heaven of Jupiter, that on top of the eagle he sees pagans as well as Christians. Truly shocking image for a medieval Christian. But what he realizes that all these individuals, they're still individuals. He sees them as individual souls. He recognizes them as persons. But in heaven, their will, their desire, their sight, their knowledge is now their own, but also moving in complete harmony with the divine will, sight, knowledge. That's the transformation that enables a plural, that the many, as it were, to join with the one. Science, I think, needs to change too, and I think we particularly need to discover what the Neoplatonists particularly were keen on. Here's the hierarchies of angels from Neoplatonic texts, which were adopted by Christianity as well, that what we're engaged with when we're studying the natural world are actually intelligences. We're not just, discovering forces. And again, when you look, Einstein makes this remark that he realizes that he only has intelligence about the natural world because he's tapping into an intelligence that's far greater than his own. When I did my physics degree, my physics tutor actually would say such things. He was sort of an agnostic, but his physics didn't make him an atheist. It was perhaps because he worked professionally on dark matter. And when I did my physics 30 years ago, he had a big poster outside his room saying, "Dark matter, does it exist?" And when I saw him about a year or so back, the poster was still there. Dark matter, does it exist? He hasn't had the ease of thinking that physics sorts everything out. And I think science, when you start to look, it's very problematic, very complicated area, but there are good signs, I think. I'm going to skip this slide and just move to the key faculty that we have, which is one of imagination. I think that, and I've got this a bit from Steiner, and as much as I understand Steiner, I think Steiner felt that the imagination is so important because imagination reaches out from us in our fantasies and so on, and often they're confused and mistaken and don't make sense, and they just sort of die, a bit like Coleridge said. But occasionally they strike reality, and when they do that, they come back to us as inspiration, and they survive, they live, they take us somewhere where we can develop those imaginings. because they connect with reality and we feel reality speaking to us through them. And then in time they can become a new intuition, a new, as it were, felt perception about the way the world is, which we know with the mind's eye, an intuition that becomes the new ground that we can rest upon. In the language of the incarnation, you might say that we become aligned with the divine within us and live more from that part of our I amness, the divine I am, rather than the small I am that was, as it were, reaching out in imaginative activity rather desperately often before. And so Blake, too, I think, realized this. I know no other Christianity and no other gospel than the liberty, both of body and mind, to exercise the divine arts of imagination. And he calls Christ the imagination because he realizes that the key insight around incarnation for us now, which Christ embodied, was to know the divine I am within us, which we do through stirring our imagination, reaching out, struggling, making mistakes, all that kind of stuff. But occasionally, inspiration returns to us. And when we run with that, when we've learned to discern that, a new intuition, a new ground, a new sense of divinity becomes possible. That's just a summary slide. I'm going to draw to a close there as he's speaking for the best part of an hour, maybe a little more. I think we still have some time for a few questions. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I've overrun my time. I'm going to go outside, where my book is on sale. I hope it has stirred something up. Maybe the fact that with no questions is going to leave you in this sort of slightly frustrated sense. But maybe it's as important as anything positively I've said. I think Barfield matters to our times. I think if you're at all interested in the Christian tradition, which does matter to our culture, he wants to steer us, as Jeremy said, to rediscovering the kind of mystical core once more. It's got to be a struggle, I think, if you're part of a church. I do think it's going to require quite a lot. The churches are declining. People aren't finding something in it, apart from occasionally, and in certain places like cathedrals. But it's not reaching people in the way that it did. But it perhaps matters to us all as well. And Barfield can teach us something about this process of bringing our own sense of self to the spiritual quest and how we engage with texts and traditions from all around the world. Thank you very much.